We had 500,000 people staying at Airbnb for the Paris Olympics. That's equivalent of like 8 Olympic stadiums worth of people. And 50,000 new homes were listed on Airbnb just for that reason. When Taylor Swift came and she did her international tour, you can literally predict her tour by looking at the rising occupancy of Airbnbs. And it was like a massive phenomenon. And her tour generated a bigger business lift than some giant international events that would be in these cities.
Okay, here with Brian Chesky. Just upfront disclosure, Airbnb, I am a shareholder. It's one of my biggest holdings. I'm a big fan of the company. Anyways, enough of that shit. Brian, where does this podcast find you?
I'm actually in New York, though I usually live in San Francisco. I'm in Airbnb's office here in New York.
Got it. I've always thought, and I mean, we'll come back, we'll talk specifically about Airbnb, but I've always thought you guys are a great forward-looking indicator of where the economy is headed and travel trends and consumer spending and what people are spending money on. What what can you provide insight into in terms of the economy and travel trends as evidenced by what's happening on your platform?
One of the things that I think is so notable in the last year was this the year of events on Airbnb. You saw the Paris Olympics. We had 500,000 people staying at Airbnb for the Paris Olympics. That's equivalent of like 8 Olympic stadiums worth of people. And 50,000 new homes were listed on Airbnb just for that reason. When Taylor Swift came and she did her international tour, you can literally predict her tour by looking at the rising occupancy of Airbnbs. And it was like a massive phenomenon. And her tour generated a bigger business lift than some giant international events that would be in these cities. So we're starting to see like a lot of more people want to gather for events. And why are they doing that? I think people are desiring connection. They want to get out of the house. They want to have a shared experience. They want to have that experience with other people. This often involves traveling. More and more people are not living in the same city as people they grow up with. And so they have to travel to see them. They do more of these annual trips together. We're seeing a huge boom in ski destinations. That's like really popular. So like the Austrian Alps, the Italian Alps, the French Alps this winter. Seeing a lot more people go to Southeast Asia. So basically, the summary is that travel is going strong. I think that it's just the very beginning. I think as emerging middle classes the first things people want to do is travel, and as the economy is strong, more people will travel. So that's what we're seeing.
I've heard there was sort of this revenge travel trend after COVID, and that I've actually talked to some hotel operators saying that actually travel has started to wane a little bit because people kind of got that itch scratched, and now it's starting to come back a little bit. Are you seeing the same trends?
What we're seeing is like what I would describe as like probably the post-pandemic kind of equilibrium. So during the pandemic, there was like basically three things didn't happen. People didn't go to cities, they didn't cross borders, and they didn't travel for business. And so you had this different type of travel that we benefited from that hotels didn't, which is people getting in cars and staying in big homes in more rural or like less urban destinations. Then you had this huge boom, which I think was a little bit of a natural amount of pent-up demand. I think the pent-up demand is now subsided, and now we're in the new world. The new world, though, is quite a lot of travel, and I think it's gonna continue to grow, but it's definitely not like the pent-up demand era of like 2021, 2022. Now, we still grow because we grow through all that.
Any trends in terms of demographics around who's traveling more, who's traveling less, and what it says about the health of our economy?
There's a lot more people are traveling in groups. Before the pandemic, it was a lot of like solo travelers and couples. Now it's families. And I think there's a couple explanations for why. I mean, one obvious demographic shift is like Scott. I mean, I started this company when I was 26. I'm like a millennial, and most 26-year-olds don't have families. But like, essentially, there was a big question when people are in their 30s and 40s: do they age at Airbnb or do they keep using Airbnb? Well, luckily for us, the answer is they kept using Airbnb, and a lot of those people now have families. So there's a whole generation of people that started as single people, then they used Airbnb for like couples travels, and now they're using it for family travel. Additionally, I just think a lot of families are now realizing Airbnb is a better solution for a lot of travel than hotels. We have this big advertising campaign. It's kind of almost like a references the Mac versus PC campaign. It's kind of like Airbnb versus hotels. We kind of show that for family travel, for group travel, like people being able to stay in a house, be able to cook together, not be separate in different rooms is really compelling. So that's probably the big one. The other one we're seeing a couple others. People are staying longer. The length of stay is going up. And I think maybe the answer to that, the explanation is people more flexibility, right? The fact is, like 10 years ago, it would be unthinkable for you and I to do an interview unless we were in the same city together. And now with Zoom and this technology, we can be able to do that. So I think there's a lot more flexibility. And then I think people are just traveling to more locations, right? I think, before everyone went to Rome, everyone went to Paris, everyone went to Vegas, everyone went to Miami. They're still going to all those places, but they're also going to a lot of smaller towns and cities and different destinations. I think social media drives that because there's a lot of new destination discovery on Instagram, TikTok, and others.
So I follow you and I read your earnings releases, and you talked about a new feature you guys are working on called the co-host network. Can you say more about that?
You know, Airbnb, we're only as good as the homes we have. And one of the keys to Airbnb is we want to make sure Airbnb is affordable. Well, let's take a city. If a city doesn't build housing, what happens to the price of housing? It typically goes up. If we don't add enough Airbnbs, then the price of Airbnb goes up. So we need to add a lot more supply, literally millions and millions more homes we want to add in the coming years. The number one reason people don't list their home on Airbnb is because they perceive it as being too much work. And it is for some people. And let's say like you live in New York and you have like a summer home in Florida, or maybe you maybe use it in the winter actually. Um, and you want to put on Airbnb, but you're not physically there. So either you can host or you go on Google and you type like, Airbnb property manager, and a third party property management company that has nothing to do with Airbnb could take over custody of your property. But why that is a problem is the average 5-star rating for third party property managers in Airbnb is only like 4.62, which is not nearly as high a rating as individual hosts. So we thought, what if we like took a marketplace approach to this? What if we paired homeowners, people with homes that don't have time, that want to make extra money, with people that have time, they're really great hosts in Airbnb and they would like to expand, but they don't have access to properties themselves. And so that's exactly what we've done. We built a network of 10,000 co-hosts. These are the best local hosts. The average rating is 4.85. So these are like great hosts, and we'll match you with them. And the other thing is, not only do we match you, Scott, but we built this really elegant in a software integration. I think if you get your hands on it, I think you'll hopefully agree that it's a really beautiful, seamless integration. So they can manage everything about your Airbnb, or just the bookings, or just the cleaning, or just the checking in of guests. You negotiate the rate with them, and so it's pretty turnkey.
Let's break down the economics. I own a place in Soho, and I decide, all right, I want to monetize it or I want to get some return on it. And let's just say I can rent it out for 500 bucks a night. If I rent it out for 500 bucks a night, how much would I typically end up paying to Airbnb, and how much, if I totally wanted to outsource it, of that 500 bucks would go to a co-host? I'm trying to figure out the net to the owner.
We have a blended take rate of 15%.
Yep.
So, now if you rent it out for $500 a night, you actually get 97% of it because we withhold 3%, and then we add an additional about 12% additional guest fee. But let's just keep the math really simple, and let's assume that you're saying $500 a night is what the guest pays, right? Just to keep the math simple. So it's 500 times, 0.15, and that's
75 bucks. Yep.
yep, so that's $75. And then, with a co-host, you'll probably negotiate between 10, 20, 30% take rate, and it's basically what you negotiate and how much they take home. So I think it's very reasonable, even with a co-host, that you could take 60, 70% home.
We'll be right back. You strike me as sort of ground zero for a company that could potentially leverage AI. I want to understand how you're using AI, where you've seen real ROI, where it may have been overhyped. And I'm just curious, as a business owner that I imagine is being pitched by, I imagine you and Sam have had a lot of conversations, and that there's a lot of AI companies that would love to put out a press release saying we're the exclusive AI partner, and maybe you've already done this with Airbnb. But I would like to get one, your how you're using AI, and two, just as a business person who has real insight into technology, where you think AI is underhyped or overhyped.
I think AI's long-term impact on society is perhaps underhyped. I think that, anyone that has a child today, the world they're going to grow up in is going to be so fundamentally different than they can imagine because of what happens when computers can essentially think. And I think it's going to change society. But I remember in like I don't know, mid 2010s, there was the self-driving car craze. And people were saying in 2014, 2015 that there would be very few people that would be driving cars, that driving a car would be anachronistic like riding a horse, and you would only do it if you enjoyed it. And while that's probably the long-term truth, we're almost 10 years post the self-driving car craze, and it's still very rare to see a self-driving car on the road. And so I think the lesson here is that this technology is going to have a much bigger impact on society than probably think. But what's that old saying? You overestimate what you can done in a year, and you underestimate what's possible in 10 years. I think we in Silicon Valley do that all the time. We invent a technology and we think society's just going to adopt it, and it's going to take a lot longer. And so I think that all of us were way too Pollyannish when ChatGPT launched, and I think we all thought all of our businesses were gonna change in 3 or 4 years, and honestly, like, if I just, like, I don't know, here's a good test. I open my phone, I look at the apps on my home screen, I ask, "How many of these apps have fundamentally changed because of generative AI?" And I really can't say very many have. Maybe the algorithms are marginally different. There's some interesting, kinda on the margins filters that are possible because of AI, but their experience is not that different than a pre-AI startup. So I would say if you think about the stack, you've got the model, you got the chips. There's a lot of development there, mostly just NVIDIA. Now there's a huge amount of development at the model level. Obviously, OpenAI was the frontier model, but there's so many others. But there's been very little innovation on the app front. And I think all of us are trying to basically figure out, like, what is the application interface paradigm, in a, like, AI world? One of the comments that Johnny Ive made, he's a designer that I work very closely with. He designed, almost all the products between iMac and, iPad,
Uh-huh.
and beyond, was he noticed that there was a user interface paradigm of the graphical user interface formed in the 1970s, popularized in the 1980s, basically a mouse and a point and click. And then you had multi-touch introduced in 2007 with the iPhone. So a lot of startups are starting to work on these new layers, but mostly what these startups are doing is scraping data, the kind of same data that OpenAI would scrape or the data that Google would scrape, and they're just trying to do marginally different interfaces by doing these kind of pseudo assistants, but assistants are very chatbot. And I think a chatbot is just, you know why I don't think a chatbot's the right interface? For the same reason that, like, I have a messaging app, but I don't want to use that to do the like to do a computation. I want to open a calculator and have a different interface for the calculator. So in other words, I think every job wants a different interface, and I don't think we can revert to that, like, the universal chatbot interface to be able to handle all these different tasks. It actually is very inefficient for things like travel. I don't think a chatbot is the way to book travel. So that's like my general commentary. Now let's take Airbnb. I think the thing that will first get revolutionized through AI via Airbnb is customer service. Just to give you a sense, we have a Scott, very difficult customer service challenge. We get more than 10 million calls and chats a year. They come from people in every country in the world. And a lot of the calls are urgent, like, I'm locked out, there's a problem. And we often have to adjudicate disputes between a guest and a host that don't even speak the same language. And because we're travel, we have a lot of seasonal workers, right? Like, and so the seasonal workers is a lot of turnover. And so you'll often call a customer service agent that is seasonal, and a lot of them are new, and they're trying to handle, like, adjudication between guests and hosts, and there's like 100 different policies, and the policies can be like 100 pages of documentation. And so AI can be the front line. It can basically speak every language. It can be 24/7. It can read the corpus of all your policies. It can also look at the last million times something happened and say, based on that, this is the best predicted resolution. And of course, it can be a tool for customer service agents to provide better service. So I think customer service is the first thing that's gonna be reinvented, at least in the e-commerce space, because of AI. And then I think the question is, can you bring that customer service paradigm to search? In other words, can search be not a chatbot, but a slightly more conversational experience where it's not like the Amazon paradigm where it's a search box and filters, but it's a little bit more this app that's getting to know you, understanding you. It's more personalized, and that would probably be phase two.
I've sort of, and I might have this wrong, but I was really just fascinated by the Meta earnings call. I think it was two earnings calls ago where he said, and I've never seen this before, we've increased our revenues 23% year on year while decreasing our headcount 20%. And what I've generally found, the analogy I would use is that AI is a little bit like corporate Ozempic, and that it turns off the signal we have as managers, CEOs, and directors that just because we're growing doesn't need we need to eat more, or in this case, we don't need to hire more. Have you thought, and I realize this is a difficult conversation for CEOs to have, but has AI given you the sense to maybe rethink if you need more employees and to see how technology can make you more efficient and all? What's happened to your employee headcount over the last 12 months?
I went through one of the first big layoffs in Silicon Valley, since the pandemic. We were like kind of a well-known layoff. We had to cut 25% employees, but actually we lost like almost half the employees because we also had to cut 10% of contingent workers. And then when you're a travel company, a pandemic, like people tend to leave you for other hotter fields, or other hotter industries. So we ran the experiment of having significantly fewer employees against our will. We weren't looking to do this. And something remarkable happened. The remarkable thing happened is that we actually started getting more work done with fewer people. And it was partly because there was a massive communication tax, and that like people are in meetings all day, and they're in meetings all day because people create meetings and you can try to impose things. But it turned out we had too many people probably. And we never would have realized that until we kind of ran the experiment of having fewer people. And we actually started getting a lot more done. So then I, mentioned this to Mark Zuckerberg, and I'm close to him, and I think he kind of realized that there were a lot of efficiencies to be gained, and obviously he made his decisions with this year of efficiency. I think he found that there was a huge communication tax, and that they probably had way too many people. Now it's hard for a CEO because you don't want to always be on the side against hiring people. I'll say this, I think that most startups raise too much money, they hire too many people. I don't think that has to be against workers. I think that they can just be redistributed to other companies, that we should fund more companies. There should be more startups built, but that startups should probably not hire so many people. I think that's a general view I have. I think is making people marginally more efficient, but I've not seen yet a massive displacement of workers because of AI. Whether it's customer service, we still have mostly agents doing it, and then software engineering. It can make software developers a lot more efficient, but it is not reducing our workforce. And actually, the way this would probably work is we'd probably, if AI made everyone more efficient, instead of downscaling the employee base, we'd probably try to get more revenue per employee. So we wouldn't be eliminating jobs. We would hope that the revenue per employee would increase so they have more leverage. And we're starting to see this. We're starting to see that what we're seeing is our headcount is only growing in low single digit percentages year over year. And our revenue is growing faster than our headcount. And I'd like that to continue. And so a metric of revenue per employee or free cash flow per employee hopefully will massively increase. We won't have fewer employees, we'll just do more revenue.
So you had a bit of a viral moment. You probably weren't planning this, and I just want to say I thought your comments were sort of taken out of context around founder mode. Talk a little bit about what you meant, and it kind of went wild. Everyone, my favorite meme was, "I'm going to go founder mode on this breakfast burrito." Founder mode? Question mark.
Let me say this. I'm not sure anyone really knows what founder mode is because Paul Graham wrote an essay about it, but he never described exactly what it was. So let me just give a little bit of backstory. I was asked to go to see a Y Combinator alumni event. It was the first time they got basically 100 startups that are, like around $1 billion market cap or higher, later stage companies. They did basically like the equivalent of a conference. They had different speakers. I joined last minute. It was off the record. I remember them telling you like, you're going to do this talk and no one's ever going to know you did this talk. It's off the record. There will be no knowledge of it. So I do this talk off the record, and I basically describe my experience from 2009 to 2019, going through hypergrowth. But the problem was, I was told a certain philosophy of leadership, which is hire great people and entrust them and empower them to do their job. And that sounds great, but there was a big missing piece of the puzzle, which was being in the details and being close. And I had let go, and I noticed this paradox that the more I let go, the more dysfunctional the company got. The more people thought it was leadership meddling, and so the further I got from the details of the company. And I would hire these people and I thought they were doing a good job. And I would find out years later they weren't doing the job I thought they were doing because I wasn't close enough to the job. So I think Paul Graham wrote this essay. It was a very compelling essay. I think the theory is a really great way he framed it, that there's this orientation that is germane to founders, which is being in the details, having real ownership of your company, which is different than a classic manager mode. But to be clear, I never said this was something exclusive to founders. Basically, the general principle is being in the details and being very, very hands-on. And it's this basic idea that great leadership is not absence. Great leadership is presence. And then the counterpoint is, well, what about like, isn't this sound like micromanagement? Isn't this micromanagement? And no one wants to work for a micromanager. And here are my two thoughts on micromanagement. Number one, I actually think like a lot of people are afraid to get in the details because be accused of being a micromanager. And I actually think a lot more leaders would benefit from being in the details and model more hands-on leadership. But the other thing is what Steve Jobs said, because what I took from founder mode, a lot of it was what I learned observing Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs said he didn't believe he was a micromanager because he said that what I do is I'm in the details, but I'm partnering with the people. And if you ask Johnny Ive, I don't think Johnny Ive thought Steve Jobs was a micromanager, but Steve Jobs visited the design studio every single day. They had lunch every single day together. They were talking. Steve was steeped in every detail of the design of the iPhone, but he wasn't telling Johnny what to do. They were having discussions. They were partnering. And I think that's the key. I remember one time I had an employee and they asked me, is this your decision or is this my decision? And I said, that's exactly the problem. Every decision should be our decision. This notion of this black and white like decision making authority between owner and worker, manager and employee is, I think, the problem, that you're kind of partnering with people in the details, working with them. And so that was probably the single most important philosophy, that as a founder or as a leader, you set the pace of the organization. You set the standards of equality. You set the standard of how much you care. You identify excellence. That you work with the leaders on the ground, and you don't defer to them, but you don't tell them what to do. You're constantly partnering with them. And the one reason you shouldn't defer to your leaders is because oftentimes you'll have different leaders come from different functions with different interests, and they'll conflict. And you're the only leader, or maybe if you're a general manager, you're one of the ones that can actually consolidate and have the most global view and make the most macro decision based on all the different inputs.
So let's talk a little bit about the company and the stock. And you're a public company CEO, so you can plead the fifth on anything here or just say you can't comment. But your revenue is 2.75 billion most recent quarter. That's up double digits. That's up 11% year on year. Net income over half a billion, 555 million, representing a net income margin of 20%, which is very healthy. Adjusted EBITDA of about 894 million, up 9% year on year, and represented an adjusted EBITDA margin of 33%. These are solid numbers. Airbnb generated a billion of free cash flow in Q2 and 4.3 billion of free cash flow over the trailing 12 months, which is, I think, the most you've ever done. Now, the bad news, since the company went public, its first trade to retail investors, and I forget we went public 4 or 5 years ago, um, it's effectively flat. If you've purchased the stock, you're effectively flat. I mean, there's been some bumps and some ups, some downs. But is this a case of where, quite frankly, you went public in a market that was very frothy and the company is growing into that valuation? At some point, investors are going to get, or shareholders are going to get restless and say, this is a great company that's growing. How come it's not reflected in the stock price? What is it, as a CEO, is it you're going to continue to block and tackle and just continue to stay the course? Do you think it might involve acquisitions moving forward? But what would you say to a shareholder who's been in the stock the last 4 years and, quite frankly, it's underperformed the rest of the market?
I think there's a couple things going on. I think that beginning of 2020, we had a private market valuation of 30 billion. Then the pandemic hit and we raised debt and the warrants were priced at 18 billion. So that might be the best proxy for evaluation. In April 2020, we were 18 billion. Then our goal in the summer was to go public at 30 billion. Like we don't want the last round investors to be underwater. So we would
Yeah.
like to clear 30 billion. And then by the time we priced the stock, we priced it at 50 billion. And then the first day of closing went to 100 billion. And that was crazy. And It was not what we expected. I did not think the stock would pop and double. If I did, I probably would have increased the issue price. And we probably at that point had a valuation that was a little ahead of our numbers. We were not generating a huge amount of free cash flow. We were not profitable on an EBITDA basis in 2020. The market was super frothy. So now, there's this old saying, you're never as good as
Yeah.
they seem, you're never as bad as they seem. Were we as good as they seemed in 2020? I don't know. Maybe we got a little frothy, but we're certainly not as bad as people say now. Those that are a little bit cynical of the company. I mean, you mentioned we did like over 4 billion in free cash flow. We have one of the highest free cash flow margins in all of Silicon Valley. We put out a little bit softer guidance for a quarter, and that like really had a huge impact on the stock price because investors, they'll like kind of forecast a subtle change in growth rate over the next 5 or 10 years, and it massively changed your valuation. What I would just say is the following: I'm 43. I intend to, continue to run this company for the coming decades. I want to build one of the great defining generational companies. And I'm spending a lot of energy taking Airbnb, which was basically a noun and a verb. That's one vertical, and trying to do what Amazon did in the late 90s, which was take a platform, an e-commerce platform that's designed for books, and bring it to everything. And I think that there's going to be a massive amount of category expansion for Airbnb beyond short-term rentals. So you're going to start to see that next year. We have some really exciting ideas that we're working on. But beyond that, there's a huge amount of growth in our core business. And I would just point to a few things. Number one, quality control. We are now bumping up against the growth rate of what Airbnb can kind of grow its growth rate without better quality control, because we are now an alternative to hotels. A lot of hotel travelers are comparing Airbnbs, and they want the similar level of consistency and quality. For every person who stays in Airbnb, 9 people stay in a hotel. If we can get one of those people to stay in Airbnb, we double the size of our business. And then you've got international markets. Most of our business is in like 6 or 7 countries. So we're in 220 countries, but most of our business is in US, Canada, Australia, UK, France. So there's so many opportunities in Asia. I mean, there's many countries in Europe, Latin America, where there's huge growth expansion. So that's the next frontier.
Okay, so without revealing your corporate plans, I think of Airbnb loosely as you're great at monetizing fallow assets and creating community. And that might be the wrong description, but that's how I think of it. So, what are the most monetizable assets? People's homes. You're kind of in that. Next would be commercial real estate. I could see. I don't like apparel. People have tried that. It isn't working. I could see private jets. I could see, just what am I missing? What are, in your view, without giving,
Oh, you're missing the biggest one of all, people's time.
so like Skillshare? Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, what do I say without saying it? There's a lot of services that are available that we could go into. So imagine Amazon, they had books, but they went initially into DVDs and CDs when those existed, and then all these different retail categories. So we're looking at, let me just break it down for you. So you have short-term rentals, which is our core business. You have long-term rentals. Long-term rentals will be defined as 30 days or longer. So that's the same asset, but for longer stays, and seasonal, that's huge. Then, yes, you do have like car rentals and boats and other large assets. But they're not as big as your house, but those are your next biggest assets in your life. But again, the biggest asset are people's time. So services and experiences would be a big opportunity for us. But as far as like going down the list of those categories, there are dozens and dozens of categories, but I'll kind of start to accidentally and reveal our new product if I do that.
But just to double click on that, I'm outstanding at installing energy efficient HVAC, and I'm in Delray Beach. And I'm very good at installing solar panels or installing soapstone kitchen counters in homes that need this. My problem is new business. Can I see an environment where I put my services and pictures and photos, similar to the way you would advertise an apartment, on your platform, and you bring them a bunch of business and assure a certain level of quality in exchange for that 15% fee everybody wins? Is that a logical extension?
That's a logical extension. It wouldn't be the first extension. We would probably start with things a little more adjacent to travel and to hosting an Airbnb. But down the road, almost any type of service, I mean, not, I don't want to say almost any type of service, but many services, including building maintenance, cleaning, interior design, upkeep your property. We built the co-host platform. This co-host network we built, we took lessons from Amazon. And the lesson from Amazon is don't build a book marketplace based on ISBNs, build an abstracted marketplace where you can sell diapers and books and a number of things on the same platform. So that's what we've done. We basically re-architected the entire platform. And so there's many services that could use the Coast network. And then on the demand side, we're I'll probably stop there because but you'll see there'll be more things coming.
And when you're thinking is kind of 2025 the year where you start rolling out and
Yep.
testing
Yep. Every
adjacents?
year, I made a statement on the earnings call. I believe I can stick with it, which is every year for now on, we're going to launch 2 to 3 new businesses or verticals that we believe will one day generate an incremental $1 billion of revenue or more. So you're going to start to see those next year.
And will you do this organically or will you make small tuck-in acquisitions to give you a head start in these
Primarily
categories?
organically, and the reason why is because similar to Apple, when Steve ran it, we're a functional organization, and so it's kinda difficult organization to plug in, like, businesses because then they become divisions, but, if they're small acquisitions or if it's extremely compelling, we'll always take a look at it, and, I mean, I will just say, like, a lot of entrepreneurs really wanna work with Airbnb, they're very motivated. I think we have a very entrepreneurial culture, especially for an S&P 500 company, so, it is a very appealing, place for an acquisition candidate.
Well, let me just ask you this. You've got a $85 billion market cap. I'm
Yep.
sorry, 84, $85 billion market cap. Lyft, the number two, has a $6 billion market cap. So you'd have to pay a premium of 8 billion for 10% dilution. Why wouldn't you take a flyer and become the number two and then maybe the number one in terms of sharing or monetizing people's cars?
I mean, these are like, and I think there's a lot of opportunities. One of the frameworks that Jeff Bezos had, I think, is this idea of perishable, non-perishable opportunities. And I think doing an acquisition, most of those acquisitions are not perishable. I mean, maybe someone else could take them out, but we generally think that we want to get a little more momentum in the core business, get to a little bit larger scale before we try to absorb large companies and large acquisitions. So that's kind of why we've tried to build our muscle. Having done acquisitions in the past, they're very, very time consuming. I think acquisitions benefit larger corporations because they can absorb the acquisition, right? I think a smaller company struggles with just the administrative.
You think of yourself as a you're $84 billion market cap. You're by far and away the largest hotel company in the world by number of rooms, growth. You have solid EBITDA. It's just funny that you
We're a
think that way.
baby.
I would think
We're
that
a baby compared to what we're gonna become. And by the way, we only have 7,000 employees or so. I think Uber has, like, 30,000. So, yeah, maybe today they're double the market cap, but they also have, like, 4 to 5 times the number of employees. So, we're actually a smaller company from an employee base than people realize. We try to build, like, this not a Navy, but like the Navy SEALs, this lean elite group. But I think this is just the very beginning. Like, I gotta tell you, Scott, I'm 43, but I have more energy, more motivation, and more passion than I was when I was 26 and I was running this company. And I just see endless opportunity for this company. I think we've done a lot of the hard work to rebuild our company from the ground up, to be prepared for this next phase where we can take Airbnb and bring it to more business models around the world. So I mean, yeah, it's just maybe it's a mindset, Jeff. Like Steve Jobs said, Apple's the world's biggest startup. And I think you know what he means by that. Jeff Bezos had his version. He called it day one. It's all basically is the road in front of you longer than the road behind you. And for us, it is.
so. I pitched you on this idea privately 18 months ago, and the statute of limitations are over, so I can pitch it to you publicly. But Airbnb Plus, or whatever we call it, and I pay $50 a month, and it does a few things. One, when I'm in a city, I have access to cool gyms like an Equinox or whatever. I have access to concierge services, but more than anything, it's a thinly veiled aspirational community slash dating site. And that is, I travel so much, and when I'm in a town, I'm almost always alone. And I find myself at 5 or 6 or 7 p.m. thinking, I don't know what to do. And if there were other entrepreneurs, if there were other academics, if there were other people from New York or just locals, what about some sort of Airbnb plus community offering?
I think it's incredibly compelling. I think you sold me. I'm in. Listen, 18 months ago, I was in when you told me, And the only reason we haven't done it is because we had really foundational things. People were complaining about Airbnbs aren't affordable. They were complaining about our customer service. They were complaining about like there were a lot of things. There were a lot of complaints. And so I felt like, well, we got to get our house in order. We still have to grow into this valuation. We have to generate a real consistent profit on a free cash flow basis. And we have to address a lot of these issues that customers are brought up. And over the last 2 years, we made 430 upgrades and improvements. So yes, we are now looking for this expansion. I've always believed that there was some type of Airbnb membership model, not necessarily a points program, but where you get access. And I guess my only question back to you is, are you available as an advisor?
Oh, Jesus Christ, Brian. You're so full of shit. I'm always available. I'm always,
Hey,
I
we're
love
gonna
this
talk. We're
company.
gonna talk privately after this.
Yeah.
But
Anyways,
I think
thanks
it's
for
a
that.
great idea, and I generally do see Airbnb as a community. I mean, like in Berlin tonight, there are tens of thousands of Airbnb people that are staying there. We can match them together. They can do a variety of things. Those local businesses would love to have specific travelers, and they could tell us which travelers they want, and we could target just those travelers.
I think there's a social overlay here, and that is, I think that there's a crisis or an epidemic in loneliness,
100%.
and young people aren't connecting in a safe environment where they want to know each other and want to establish professional and personal relationships. There's a lack of third spaces. People aren't going into work, they aren't going to church, they aren't participating in organized athletics as much. And I think that you guys are in a position to provide third spaces on a pretty big scale. Look, I now I'm gonna sound like your mother here. Last time you were on the show, you spoke about feeling like a 61-year-old and you were 41 there, so 43-year-old's body, working 18 hours a day, essentially living like a monk during the pandemic to scale Airbnb from 18 to 85 billion. So over a year later, have you been able to make strides in reconnecting with the personal side of your life? Do you found as if you found more balance, or is this still kind of an ongoing journey?
No, it's been a major change for me. Kind of three changes. The first change is I've gotten much healthier. I was always into exercise, but I think a lot of entrepreneurs we glamorize sleep deprivation, and I think until recently, no one was talking about the benefits of sleep. But I think only like last 5 or 10 years. But in the truth, when I started, like it was a badge of honor to never sleep, and I would do that for years. And then, we didn't really like we weren't that healthy, and I'm much more healthy now. I'm sleeping more, I'm exercising, and I think that's a good trend in Silicon Valley that like people seem to be much more mindful of health and fitness. So that's the first thing. Second thing is I'm spending a lot more time with friends, and I one of the things I do with friends is I travel. You and I talked about like one of the great ways to have a shared experience is to travel with people, and like that's a great form of memories, and I do that. And then I've started to the third category is like I'm single and I'm 43, and then I've waited longer than I ever thought I would to meet someone and have a family, but I do desire to have a family, and so I've been dating a little bit, and hopefully I meet someone.
And you also said on the professional front, you talked about your desire for Airbnb to have a next act, your
Yes,
Disneyland, your AWS, your
yes,
iPhone moment.
yes.
Give me a moonshot crazy idea that people wouldn't expect from Airbnb or Brian Chesky.
There's so many, but I'll just pick one based on the conversation we've had. Loneliness. People are lonely. I think there's a massive way that we can facilitate people meeting one another. So I'll give you an example. If you travel by yourself, you ever go to a restaurant, you got to eat at the bar by yourself, and sometimes,
All the time.
okay,
It's literally one of my favorite things and it's
okay,
pathetic.
yeah, yeah, I do it too, actually. I do go to the bar and sometimes by myself get food, and I like it. But I have no alternative. Like, if I'm traveling by myself, that's the only choice. So what if we could basically pair Airbnb travelers together at restaurants, pre-book reservations, and bring travelers together? Taylor Swift, number 2, she, like, obviously had this incredibly unprecedentedly successful concert tour, and we noticed in Europe where her concert was, we saw this massive rise in Airbnb bookings. And what if you could sell concert tickets on Airbnb, but not just sell concert tickets, but you could actually pair people together to go to the concerts. They can meet one another. We could go down the list of other types of things like pickup sports. So there are kind of things you might not think of as Airbnb, but if we're talking about difficulty meeting one another, there's a lot of ways we can pair people together. So I think the most non-obvious, biggest idea would be Airbnb becoming like a social network in the physical world, not an online social network, but essentially a physical social network where we're matching people together in real life around events and shared experiences.
God, I just thought of it. You should take on Live Nation. And by the way, I love the idea of you sitting alone at a bar and everybody being like, "Isn't that Brian Chesky?" By the way, you know what I call when I see, I'm not young nor a billionaire and not as good looking as you. You know what I call eye contact at a bar when I'm eating alone?
What?
A prostitute.
Oh.
Anyways, there you go. All right, Brian.
Well, thank you,
Brian's
Scott.
literally
What a
turning
great
beet
way to
red.
yeah,
He's
what a
literally
great way to land this interview. This is great.
he's literally turning beet red here. Brian Chesky is the co-founder and CEO of Airbnb. Since launching in 2007, the firm has grown to a community of over 5 million hosts who have welcomed more than 2 billion guests in almost every country across the globe. He joins us from New York. Brian, you know I'm an enormous fan of you. I
Oh,
think
thank you.
you're not only a baller professionally in the world of tech, but I think you're just, generally speaking, a good person and
Oh,
think
thank you.
about the Commonwealth and what's good for society. And we don't always have that peanut butter and chocolate combination. So thanks for your time,
Oh,
Brian.
thank you so much, Scott. Thanks for having me.